When most people picture medieval warfare, they picture knights charging in full armor. But a lot of battles were decided by the troops nobody talks about. The scouts who controlled movement, the missile teams that shut down advances, and the hard-working specialists who made sieges and ambushes actually work. Here are the most underrated medieval troops, and the real reasons experienced armies learned to fear them. Number 1. Mounted sergeants. In most medieval armies, the knight gets the spotlight, but the cavalry that often filled out the real numbers was the mounted sergeant, a professional fighter below noble rank who trained for war and got paid for it. Their kit could be less expensive: good mail instead of the newest custom plate, a practical helmet, a sturdy shield, a serviceable horse rather than a prized destrier. But the battlefield does not care about titles. What made them feared was how useful they were across an entire campaign. They escorted commanders, guarded supply trains, and screened an army's march so an enemy could not just ride up, look around, and slip away. When a fight started, they could charge in support of knights or work the flanks where speed and timing mattered more than individual glory. A mounted sergeant's job was often to do the messy, repeatable work: short charges, quick withdrawals, and immediate pursuit when the other side started to give ground. That pursuit is a big deal. Medieval battles were often decided when one side lost cohesion and tried to pull back, and mounted professionals were the ones who could turn that moment into a full collapse by staying close and keeping pressure. They also mattered in sieges. You needed mounted men to patrol roads, intercept messengers, escort foragers, and stop relief forces from getting easy information. If you could not control movement outside the walls, the siege could drag on for months. They were flexible in a way pop culture usually misses.
If the ground was too rough for a clean cavalry hit, they could fight on foot with spear and shield, or stand in a line with other infantry. Many served in a lord's household, meaning they trained together and were used to orders, which matters when formations start to wobble. And because they were paid professionals, rather than high nobles, they tended to be direct and pragmatic about how they fought. That mix, mobility, discipline, and practicality, made them the kind of opponent you did not want hovering nearby all day. Once you notice how important this working cavalry was, it makes the next underrated group easier to understand: the light horse built for scouting and sudden strikes. Number 2. Hobelars. If mounted sergeants were the reliable middleweight cavalry, Hobelars were the fast, light option that commanders used when they needed eyes and speed more than heavy impact. The name comes from the small, tough riding horses, often called hobbies, and these riders show up a lot in the British Isles and the border wars of the 1200s and 1300s, where wet ground, broken hills, and narrow lanes made classic knightly charges hard to pull off. A hobelar usually carried a light lance or spear and could add javelins, a sword, or a short bow. Armor was lighter too, sometimes just a padded coat with a helmet, because the whole point was mobility. They scouted ahead, guarded the flanks, and made sure an army did not march into a trap. They also did the kind of work that quietly wrecks an enemy's plan: quick hits on isolated posts, intercepting messengers, and pushing back foraging parties so the other side struggled to feed itself. Even when they were not fighting, they were shaping the battlefield by controlling who could move where. They were feared because they were hard to catch and hard to ignore. Heavy cavalry can dominate a clean, open field. A hobelar can choose when to engage and when to slip away.
In rough terrain, they could keep contact, harass a slower force, and then pull off before a countercharge landed. In pursuit, they were especially useful, because they had enough speed to stay close and enough reach with spear or javelin to punish any unit that lost formation. They also helped set up bigger attacks by forcing an enemy to turn, tighten up, or waste time guarding places it wanted to ignore. Hobelars are easy to underrate because they rarely get a heroic storyline. But medieval commanders cared about information, movement, and pressure, and light cavalry delivered all three. And once you start talking about riders who don't rely on a lance charge, it's a short step to a troop type that made heavy cavalry nervous for a different reason: mounted archers. Number 3. Turkopoles. Medieval European armies were not isolated, and nowhere is that clearer than the Eastern Mediterranean, where Crusader and Byzantine forces faced opponents who fought with speed, distance, and constant skirmishing. One underrated answer was the Turkopole, light cavalry who used bows and quick movement rather than heavy armor and a full shock charge. The exact background of Turkopoles could vary by place and time, but the basic idea stayed consistent. Locally raised or long-term resident horsemen who could fight in a Turkic style and give a Western-style army the kind of mobility it normally lacked. Turkopoles were built for the parts of warfare that heavy cavalry struggled with. They scouted, screened, and fought as skirmishers, staying just out of reach while putting arrows into exposed targets. They could probe a line, test reactions, and pull back before contact became dangerous. They also protected heavier troops from being swarmed by enemy light cavalry, which was a constant problem in open country. In that environment, having your own mounted archers was less about glory and more about survival. They were feared because they messed with timing and confidence.
Heavy cavalry wants a clear moment to commit, with a clean run-up and a target that will not dodge. Turkopoles made that moment slippery. They forced commanders to protect flanks, keep reserves, and stay disciplined, because chasing them usually meant breaking formation and losing control. And even when arrows did not punch straight through the best armor, they still caused damage where armor was thin, distracted men at exactly the wrong time, and pushed formations out of shape. Turkopoles show a pattern you see again and again. The troops people talk about least are often the ones that solve the hardest practical problems. Back in Europe, especially on frontier zones, constant fighting in rough terrain produced another underrated group that lived on speed and aggression, but on foot. Number 4. Almogavars. On the Iberian frontier, long campaigns and constant small-scale fighting created a type of soldier that was the opposite of a tournament knight: the Almogavar. The name is often linked to an Arabic word for raider, which fits what they were known for. These were tough, lightly equipped infantrymen from the borderlands of Aragon and Catalonia, used to moving fast, living rough, and striking first. They carried simple but effective weapons: short spears, javelins, and large knives, because their job was to move ahead of the main force, hit weak points, and stay mobile. Their armor was usually light, a helmet if they could get one, maybe a leather or padded layer, and not much more. That sounds thin, but it matched what they were built to do. The fear factor came from how they attacked the system, not the man. Heavy cavalry depends on momentum, clear lanes, and a target that will stand its ground. Almogavars preferred broken ground, forests, hills, and sudden contact.
Instead of trading blows with armored men head-on, they aimed at the vulnerable parts: horses, pack animals, isolated guards, the edges of a marching column, and the moments when a unit was tired or spread out. A javelin thrown from close range does not need to beat the best armor to cause chaos. It can force a rider to slow down, break formation, or dismount. They also worked well with larger armies because they handled the awkward tasks: scouting on foot, clearing rough paths, setting ambushes, and forcing an enemy to move cautiously. When groups of these fighters later served as mercenaries around the Mediterranean, their reputation traveled with them. Enemies learned to take their presence seriously because it usually meant night movement, sudden attacks on weak points, and no easy rest. Almogavars are underrated because they do not fit the famous image of medieval war, but they represent something very real. Most fighting was about control, disruption, and endurance, not just one big charge. That same practical mindset shows up in missile troops too, especially when you get to crossbow teams that could sit in cover and could shooting all day. Number 5. Pavise crossbow teams. The crossbow is often treated like a simple medieval gadget, but in real warfare it was a serious system, especially when used with a pavise, a tall shield carried by a dedicated helper. The crossbow had such a scary reputation that in the 11th century, church leaders even tried to restrict its use in wars between Christians, but armies kept using it anyway. Think of it as teamwork designed for one problem. A crossbow can hit hard, but it takes time to reload. A pavise gives the shooter a movable wall to hide behind during that vulnerable moment. A typical setup in Italian and other city armies was a crossbowman paired with a paviser. The paviser planted the shield. The crossbowman stepped out to shoot, then stepped back to reload.
Depending on the crossbow, that could be a quick belt hook draw or a slower lever or crank, which is exactly why the pavise mattered. That rhythm let them keep pressure on an enemy line or on defenders on a wall without exposing themselves as much as a lone archer would. Crossbows also had a practical advantage for recruitment. You still needed training, especially for judging distance and working as a team, but learning to draw and shoot a crossbow was generally faster than building the heavy muscle memory needed for an elite longbow. They were feared because crossbow bolts were compact, fast, and hard to ignore. Against mail armor at practical battlefield ranges, a heavy bolt could be very dangerous. And even when it did not punch clean through the best plate, it could find gaps, hit less protected limbs, or take down a horse. In sieges, where shots were often closer and targets were predictable, crossbows were ruthless tools for denying walls, gates, and battlements. They also forced enemies to adapt with thicker shields, more cover, and more cautious movement, because even a short burst of accurate fire could shut down an approach. The pavise is the underrated part of the story. People picture a lone shooter, but the feared version was a small, organized unit that combined protection, timing, and repeated accurate fire. And once missile troops are doing their job, the enemy usually tries one thing: close the distance fast. That is where the next underrated troops come in. Infantry with long polearms built to stop a rush and pull mounted men down to earth. Number 6. Billmen and halberdiers. Swords are famous, but medieval battlefields were full of polearms, and for good reason. A bill, or a halberd, is basically a toolbox on a long shaft. A point for thrusting, an edge for cutting, and a hook or spike for grabbing. In England, bills grew out of common agricultural tools and became standard infantry weapons. In parts of Central Europe, halberds and similar polearms filled the same role. They were cheaper than swords, easier to maintain, and, most importantly, very effective against both foot soldiers and cavalry. These troops were feared because reach and leverage decide a lot of medieval combat. If you can strike from farther away, you control who can touch you. If you can hook a shield, a weapon, or a rider, you can break balance and create openings for the men next to you. Against cavalry, polearms were especially nasty. A charging horse does not just face a single blade, it faces a wall of points. Even when cavalry did get in close, hooks and hard thrusts gave infantry a way to stop a rider from simply pushing through and riding free. Pole arms also shine in the unglamorous parts of war. Guarding a gate, holding a trench line, fighting in a narrow street, or pushing up a siege ladder where space is tight. A long weapon with multiple ways to strike is ideal when you cannot swing wide or choose perfect angles. That practicality is why you see bills and halberds everywhere in the later Middle Ages, even among well-equipped troops. Once infantry with pole arms became common, commanders started thinking more seriously about formations that could stop cavalry almost by default. That takes you straight to the next underrated force: disciplined pikemen, often raised by towns and communities rather than noble households. Number 7. Urban pikemen. When people imagine medieval infantry, they often picture disorganized peasants. But a lot of European towns could field disciplined foot soldiers with serious weapons. The pike is the clearest example. A pike is not just a long spear, it is a formation weapon. Used well, it turns a group of ordinary men into a moving barrier that even armored cavalry hesitates to hit. Urban militias in places like Flanders and parts of northern Italy trained for communal defense, and some of them gained real battlefield experience.
In 1302 at Courtrai, often remembered as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, Flemish foot soldiers using dense spear and pike formations helped shatter the idea that knights could always win by charging straight in. The lesson was not that cavalry was useless. It was that cavalry needs space and clean timing, and a deep wall of points can deny both. A charging horse is a living creature, and it will not willingly run into a solid hedge of sharp wood and steel. These troops were feared because pikes reward discipline. A single brave man with a long spear can be pushed aside. A tight block with multiple ranks is much harder to break. The front ranks present points, the rear ranks add pressure, and the whole unit can advance together like a slow, sharp machine. Add a few crossbowmen or men with shorter pole arms around the edges, and the formation becomes even harder to approach. Towns also had something nobles did not always have: money for standardized gear, regular musters, and leaders chosen for competence rather than pedigree. Urban pikemen are underrated because they do not match the noble-centered story people like to tell about the Middle Ages. But once towns proved they could stop elite cavalry, the battlefield started to favor organized infantry systems. That idea of a community building its own anti-cavalry solution shows up again later in a very literal way, with troops who turned wagons into fortresses. Number 8. War wagon crews. In the early 1400s, Bohemian forces in the Hussite Wars popularized a field system that made armored cavalry rethink everything: the wagon fort, often called a Wagenburg. The underrated troops here are the crews who operated it. A war wagon was not just transport. It was a fighting platform with a planned mix of people: drivers, shieldmen, crossbowmen, early handgunners, and fighters with polearms ready to protect the gaps. The concept was simple but powerful.
Wagons were arranged in a line or a box, linked together with chains, and positioned to control approaches. From behind wood sides and pavises, missile troops could fire while staying relatively protected. If cavalry tried to push in, it ran into a barrier it could not easily ride through. Horses do not like crashing into timber, and riders cannot build momentum when the space is tight. The attack slows, bunches up, and that is exactly the moment when short-range missiles and polearms do their best work. They were feared because this was not a passive defense.
A well-run wagon fort could choose its ground, absorb pressure, and then send out counterattacks once the enemy was disorganized. The wagons also carried supplies, tools, and sometimes small guns, so the system supported longer operations instead of just one set-piece battle. Training was efficient too. You did not have to turn every recruit into an expert duelist. You had to teach people their station, their timing, and how to support the wagon next to them. When that discipline held, even expensive cavalry could look suddenly out of options. War wagon crews are underrated because they show medieval warfare moving toward combined arms thinking, protection, firepower, and close-in infantry working together. And once you start seeing organized gunpowder fire on the battlefield, the next feared specialists are the people who made it truly decisive. Artillery crews. Number 9. Artillery specialists. Most medieval wars were decided around walls, not in open field showdowns, and that is why artillery crews deserve more attention. Early gunpowder cannon appeared in Europe in the 1300s, but by the 1400s, rulers were investing heavily in specialized gunners, foundries, and artillery trains. These were not random soldiers lighting a fuse. They were technicians and craftsmen who understood powder, shot, angles, and the brutal logistics of moving heavy metal across bad roads. They were feared because artillery attacked the strongest part of medieval defense: masonry. Traditional castles relied on height and relatively thin stone walls to resist ladders, rams, and missiles. A serious bombard changed the math. Given time, repeated hits could crack stone, ruin parapets, and open a breach that defenders had to rush to patch. Even when a wall did not fall quickly, artillery pressure forced garrisons to stay under cover and drained morale. In the field, smaller cannon and handheld guns were still limited in accuracy and rate of fire, but they added noise, smoke, and sudden impact that could shake less experienced troops. Artillery crews were also feared because they made war faster and more expensive at the same time. Once a ruler had a good artillery park, old-style fortifications became less reliable, and defenders had to respond with thicker walls, earthworks, lower profiles, and smarter positions. That was a slow, costly adaptation, and attackers could pick targets that had not modernized. In practice, that meant political power leaned toward whoever could pay for metal, powder, skilled labor, and transport. These specialists are underrated because they do not fit the romantic picture of medieval combat, but they were among the most important professionals of the late Middle Ages. And even with powerful guns, you still needed people willing to get close to the walls, dig, build, and solve problems under pressure. That brings up another group, the sappers and miners. Number 10. Sappers and miners. The most feared medieval troops were sometimes the ones who did not look like warriors at first glance. Sappers and miners were combat engineers. They built roads, bridges, ramps, and covered trenches that let an army reach a fortress. They cut timber, raised palisades, placed stakes, and constructed siege platforms. In a siege, sapping meant advancing toward the wall under cover, using trenches, screens, and earthworks so defenders could not simply shoot attackers down from above. It was slow and exhausting, but it let an army bring ladders, rams, and guns into workable range. Mining was the dramatic part, but it was still an engineering problem. If you could tunnel under a wall or tower and remove its support, you could create a breach without winning a fight on the battlements. Defenders knew this, which is why sieges often turned into underground contests, listening for digging countermines, and trying to intercept each other's tunnels. None of it looked heroic, but it directly threatened the one thing a garrison trusted most: its walls. These specialists were feared because they made sieges systematic. A fortress is strong when attackers have to stand in the open and improvise. It becomes weaker when attackers arrive with trained crews, proper tools, and a plan for approaching safely. Engineers also reduced an army's dependence on luck. Instead of waiting for defenders to make a mistake, they could build a new angle of attack, create cover where none existed, and keep the pressure constant. They worked closely with artillery crews, setting stable platforms, digging gun pits, and building protective screens so the gunners could fire longer without being picked off. Sappers and miners are underrated because chronicles rarely name them, even though they decided how long wars lasted. When walls fell or a garrison surrendered, it was often because engineers had done weeks of careful, exhausting work that left defenders with fewer and fewer options.